She was only a child when the shadows of her life closed in around her, the kind of shadows that were not made by night but by the cruelty of those meant to protect her. Her parents had passed away too early, leaving her in the care of distant relatives who took her not out of love, but out of obligation. From the moment she entered their home, she was treated not as kin but as an unwelcome burden, a mouth to feed and a body to clothe with no worth of its own. They looked at her with eyes that never softened, their voices always sharp, cutting her spirit day by day. She learned quickly that in this house, her silence was her only shield, yet even that silence was twisted into something ugly. They called it stubbornness, defiance, or witchery, never once considering it for what it truly was: survival. Each morning before the sun rose, she was shaken awake, her small body pushed toward chores that would have wearied even a grown woman. She fetched water from the river, the heavy clay pot cutting into her shoulders. She swept the compound until her hands blistered, bent to grind grain until her arms ached as though they would fall apart. While the other children laughed and ran in the fields, she labored under the watchful, unforgiving gaze of her guardians. No mistake went unpunished. If a pot slipped from her grasp and cracked, they declared her clumsy and struck her. If food burned while she stirred it, they claimed she had wasted what little they had and denied her a share of the meal. Even when no fault could be found, they invented one, for cruelty had become a habit in that household, and she was the vessel into which they poured all their bitterness. Her silence, which she clung to like a lifeline, was misunderstood at every turn. When they shouted at her, she lowered her eyes, hoping to avoid anger, but they accused her of arrogance, saying she looked down on them. When she tried to explain herself softly, they twisted her words into lies and punished her further. Soon she stopped speaking altogether, for each word seemed to sharpen the blade that cut her down. They took her quietness as proof of weakness, and because they thought her weak, they pushed her harder, believing she would break. Yet within her stillness something began to grow, not defiance, not hatred, but a deep, unyielding strength that none of them could see. The neighbors noticed her plight, but few dared to intervene. In the evenings, when she carried water past the other compounds, some women whispered to each other about the harshness she endured. They saw the hollowness of her cheeks, the bruises that bloomed like shadows along her arms, but when they looked toward her guardian's home, they looked away again. To speak against cruelty was to invite it into your own house, and so they kept their silence. The girl learned then that she could not rely on anyone to rescue her. She must endure, and in that endurance she became her own companion, whispering prayers to her parents' spirits in the quiet of the night, asking them to see her, to guide her, to remind her that she was not entirely alone. At times the cruelty turned deliberate and mocking. Her guardian's children, emboldened by their parents' disdain, treated her as less than human. They stole food from her portion, kicked at her feet when she walked too slowly, pulled her hair for their amusement. If she cried out, their mother or father would appear, not to scold them but to scold her. "Why do you provoke them? Why are you always in the way?" they would say, as though her existence itself was an offense. Slowly she came to understand that in their eyes she was not a girl but a shadow, something to be used and discarded, a reminder of debts and obligations they had never wanted. And yet, despite it all, she endured. She carried her grief quietly, holding it inside like an ember she refused to let die. She did not scream when struck, did not wail when denied food, did not run when mocked. Her silence was not weakness, it was armor. Still, the cruelty she bore left marks that no one could see, deep scars carved into her heart long before any iron touched her skin. She dreamed sometimes of her parents, imagined her mother's gentle touch or her father's laughter filling the air, but always woke to the hard earth beneath her thin mat, the rough voices demanding she rise and serve. As the seasons turned, the gap between her and the others grew wider. She became thin, her face drawn, her eyes too old for her years. People passing by would sometimes glance at her with pity, but pity never filled her stomach nor eased the weight of the loads she carried. Her guardians, blind in their cruelty, could not see that every blow, every harsh word, was shaping something in her that they would one day come to fear. For cruelty, no matter how it is dressed, never destroys the innocent, it reveals them. And though she could not yet know it, the silence they mistook for weakness was the very ground where her strength would take root. The day of her punishment began like many others, with shouting voices and accusations that seemed to cling to her no matter how hard she worked. That morning, the family's goat had slipped its tether and wandered into a neighbor's field, trampling the tender shoots of newly planted crops. The neighbors came in anger, demanding repayment, their voices echoing through the compound. The guardians, quick to shield their own children, turned as they always did to the orphan girl. Without hesitation, they declared it was her fault, though she had been at the river carrying water when the animal broke free. Their words carried venom, their eyes burning with blame, and the neighbors accepted their explanation with grim nods, for in every misfortune, the girl was always cast as the culprit. This time, however, the guardian's fury did not settle with slaps or cruel words. They gathered together in whispers as the crowd thinned, their faces twisted with frustration and a need to prove their authority. The stepmother's eyes gleamed with an idea both savage and certain. "She is cursed," she spat. "Her silence brings ruin. If we do not mark her, the ancestors will punish us all." The others nodded, feeding off her malice until it grew into something larger, something dangerous. By afternoon, word had spread that the girl would be punished not as a child, but as a scapegoat to carry away the family's misfortune. They brought her into the yard, forcing her to kneel while the neighbors gathered at the edges, curiosity pulling them in though unease tugged at their hearts. A fire was lit, its crackling roar filling the air as iron rods were pushed into the flames. The girl's eyes widened, but she said nothing, her silence holding steady even as the realization struck her. The heat shimmered in the air, the glowing ends of the rods reflecting in her wide, dark eyes. Her stepmother stepped forward, her lips curled in a cruel smile. "We will brand her," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut. "We will mark her so all may know the shame she carries." The girl wanted to cry out, to plead for mercy, but the years of silence held her tongue. Her heart pounded against her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She felt rough hands grip her shoulders, forcing her still. The smell of smoke grew thicker, wrapping around her, suffocating. Then came the searing pain as the first iron was pressed against her back. The sound was a hiss, like water thrown onto fire, followed by the sickening scent of burned flesh. She bit down on her lip until blood filled her mouth, refusing to scream though every nerve in her body cried out. Her guardians took turns pressing the glowing metal against her skin, their fury rising with each mark. "This will teach you," one said, pressing hard until she felt her body jolt against the ground. "This is the proof of your curse," another sneered. Each burn carved into her back was meant to strip away her dignity, to remind her that she was nothing more than the family's scapegoat. The crowd shifted uneasily, some turning away, unable to watch, while others stared with morbid fascination. Yet no one stepped forward to stop it. To interfere would mean inviting the wrath of the family, or worse, being accused of siding with the cursed child. By the time the irons were pulled away, her back was covered in raw, blistering burns, the skin cracked and angry. The pain was unbearable, but still she did not scream. She trembled, her breath ragged, tears streaming silently down her face, but not a single cry left her lips. Her silence unsettled even those who inflicted the punishment, for they expected to hear her wail, to watch her beg. Instead, she endured, her body broken but her spirit unyielding. That silence, which they had always mocked, now seemed eerie, a strength they could not understand. When at last they stepped back, her stepmother raised her chin proudly, as if she had accomplished some noble act. "She is marked," she declared to the onlookers. "Let her carry the shame of her curse for all to see." The words echoed in the yard, but their weight fell strangely, for while the family had intended the scars as symbols of disgrace, what the villagers had witnessed left them with unease. Some whispered that the punishment was too cruel, that no child deserved such torment. Others muttered that perhaps the girl's silence meant she was protected, that her endurance was not weakness but something deeper. The girl was left lying on the ground, her back burning with agony, her body too weak to rise. The crowd dispersed slowly, their murmurs following them, carrying seeds of doubt and fear into the air. Her guardians returned to the house, satisfied with the lesson they believed they had taught, blind to the truth of what they had done. They had not broken her spirit. They had carved into her a story that would soon speak louder than any voice. That night, as she lay alone, the raw pain still pulsing with every breath, she felt the heat of the burns shifting strangely. The marks did not sit still as scars should. They seemed to pulse, faintly alive, like embers refusing to die out. Though she did not yet understand it, what they had meant for shame was becoming something else entirely, a hidden design etched into her skin by forces far greater than cruelty. Under the weight of the night, the girl lay curled on the mat of dry reeds, her small frame quivering with every shallow breath she took. The pain was relentless, stabbing and searing, spreading like waves of fire across her back where the irons had been pressed. Each movement tore a gasp from her lips, but she refused to cry aloud. She knew her tears would bring no mercy. The guardians had already turned away, satisfied with their cruelty, leaving her in the darkness to bear her suffering alone. The hut was silent except for her faint whimpers and the crackle of distant insects singing through the night. Her body burned, but inside her heart trembled even more, the weight of despair threatening to crush her spirit. She wondered if this was how her life would end, broken and discarded, her flesh branded as proof of shame. But as she lay in her torment, something strange began to stir beneath the pain. The seared flesh of her back should have remained raw and twisted, but instead, as she shifted slightly and the moonlight slipped in through the cracks of the hut, she caught glimpses of faint shapes forming on her skin. The marks were not jagged burns as one might expect, but deliberate curves and lines, as though an unseen hand was etching something beyond the cruelty of punishment. At first she thought it was her mind playing tricks, a desperate illusion born of agony. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering weak prayers to the spirits, asking them to carry her pain away. The heat of the burns lingered like molten chains, but there was a strange rhythm to it now, as if the fire had chosen to shape itself rather than destroy her. Patterns slowly emerged, intertwining like vines across her back. She pressed her hands against the mat, arching slightly, trying to breathe through the strange sensation. Instead of blistering in chaotic patches, the marks seemed to connect, forming lines that spread across her flesh with impossible precision. Every heartbeat seemed to draw the design deeper, the pain transforming into something eerily purposeful. She did not understand what was happening, but she could feel it. Her body was no longer just wounded. It was being inscribed. Fear clawed at her chest. She tried to sit up, but her strength failed and she collapsed back down, panting. Her thoughts raced. Was this some lingering curse from her guardians, a deeper cruelty meant to haunt her? Or had the spirits she prayed to in her weakness decided to answer in their own mysterious way? The hut's walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows bending and swaying as though watching her suffering with interest. Each gust of night wind carried a whisper through the cracks, almost like voices murmuring in a language too old to comprehend. She felt both terrified and strangely comforted, as if her agony was not meaningless after all. As the night deepened, the fire in her wounds pulsed less with torment and more with strange warmth, almost as though it carried life instead of death. She could not see the full design herself, but she could sense its presence, stretching across her skin in deliberate pathways. The thought unsettled her. What kind of design would pain carve upon her body? Was she being marked for death, for exile, or for something she could not yet fathom? Her breath grew ragged as exhaustion threatened to pull her under, but every time her eyelids fluttered closed, she saw glimpses of images, shapes of rivers, hills, and winding paths drawn in glowing lines. It was not a dream, it was an awakening. She pressed her face into her hands and wept quietly, though not from the pain alone. There was fear, yes, but also an unshakable sense that her body was no longer hers alone. Something had claimed her scars, reshaping cruelty into a message she did not yet understand. She wanted to call out, to demand answers from the spirits, but only silence greeted her trembling voice. The hut remained still, the guardians asleep in their separate chambers, unaware that the punishment they inflicted was unfolding into something far beyond their control. The night stretched on endlessly. She lay awake, too afraid to close her eyes, too weary to sit upright. The weight of the patterns on her back grew heavier, as though destiny itself had been carved into her flesh. She thought of her parents, long gone, and wondered if they watched from beyond, if they too could see what was happening to their daughter. Perhaps this was their way of reaching her, sending signs through suffering, rewriting her story in fire and flesh. She whispered their names, and for a moment the burning eased, replaced by a strange, steady warmth. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks, her trembling finally stilled. Her back ached, but beneath the pain she felt an unsettling awareness. She was no longer marked in shame. She was marked in mystery. She did not yet know what the patterns meant, but deep inside she realized this was no ordinary scar. It was the beginning of something the world around her was not prepared to see. And though fear still clung to her heart, so too did the smallest spark of defiance, because she understood now that even suffering could carry secrets, and her suffering had spoken louder than their cruelty. When the morning sun rose higher and the girl finally staggered from her hut, her guardians sneered at her weakness, expecting her back to be nothing more than a grotesque mess of wounds and burns. They wanted the village to see her as disfigured, as a living warning against disobedience. But when she stumbled into the light and her tattered clothing slipped from her shoulders, the whispers that followed were not of disgust. The villagers who had gathered nearby out of curiosity gasped as their eyes fell on her back. The scars did not twist into chaos as burns should have. Instead, they stretched in delicate and deliberate lines, branching like rivers, circling like pathways, and crossing in patterns too precise to be dismissed as chance. At first, some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others stepped closer, drawn as though by invisible threads, unable to resist the strange beauty carved into her skin. The girl stood trembling, clutching her arms around herself, ashamed, yet sensing something monumental in the stares fixed upon her. The murmurs grew louder. What they saw was not the ruin of a child's body, it was a canvas of mystery, a living map etched into flesh by something greater than human cruelty. The elders were summoned, men and women with faces carved by time and voices weighted with memory. They approached slowly, their eyes narrowing as they studied the scars. One of the oldest leaned closer, her fingers trembling as she reached toward the girl's back but stopped short, as though afraid to touch what was not hers to touch. "These lines," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "they are not random. They follow paths I have seen before." Her words sent a ripple through the crowd, and more villagers pressed closer, their breaths uneven. Another elder, known for keeping the village's oldest stories, stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the spirals curling across her shoulder blade. "This is no accident," he said firmly. "I have seen such symbols and carvings by our ancestors, etched into stones near the sacred hills. They spoke of maps that were never meant to be drawn by human hands, but by forces that guide or destroy. And here the marks live on the flesh of a child." The girl shivered, her heart pounding, unsure whether to feel cursed or chosen. The villagers' eyes pierced her with a mix of fear, awe, and suspicion. Some whispered that she was a witch, that her suffering had invited unholy signs. Others shook their heads, insisting no witchcraft could create such precision, that it must be the spirits of the ancestors themselves reclaiming her from shame. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, while men shifted uneasily, torn between reverence and fear. The guardians who had punished her the night before tried to speak over the whispers, their voices sharp with anger. "She is cursed," the stepmother cried, pointing an accusing finger. "These marks are a plague, born of disobedience. They should be hidden, buried, forgotten." But the people did not listen as they once did. Their eyes no longer saw a weak, burdened girl, they saw a mystery too powerful to dismiss. One elder gestured for silence and the crowd obeyed. He circled the girl slowly, his voice steady as he described the patterns aloud. "Here the scar bends like a river flowing north. Here these intersecting lines mimic the old traders' routes toward the mountain. And here," he paused, his voice dropping lower, "this spiral resembles the mark carved upon the stone of ancestors, the one we were told never to forget." The villagers gasped again, and several bowed their heads instinctively, muttering prayers for protection. The girl's knees threatened to give way beneath her, but something inside her refused to collapse. She lifted her chin slightly, though her eyes glistened with tears. She had endured their cruelty, their punishment meant to break her spirit, and yet from that fire had risen something that could not be denied. She did not understand the meaning of the map, nor what destiny it carried, but she sensed that her scars had stolen power away from her tormentors and placed it into her hands. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. They could not ignore what lay before them, but neither could they explain it fully. Some urged caution, warning that maps drawn by the spirits often led to trials, not blessings. Others insisted the girl must be protected, for if the ancestors had inscribed her flesh with their will, then she was chosen for something beyond their comprehension. The debate swelled, and the villagers listened with bated breath. As the sun blazed higher, casting its full light upon her back, the mark seemed to shimmer faintly as though alive. Gasps escaped the crowd again, and one villager whispered, "It is not just a map, it breathes with her." That realization sent shivers through even the bravest among them. No longer could anyone pretend she was ordinary. No longer could cruelty define her. The guardians who had inflicted her punishment stood frozen, their faces pale, as though they too now feared the child they had tormented. By the time the crowd dispersed, the girl's life had changed forever. Her scars were no longer hers alone, they belonged to the story that had just begun to unfold. The villagers would speak of nothing else, and the elders would return again and again to study the map, trying to unlock the secrets hidden in its lines. And though the girl still carried the pain of her burns, deep within her she felt something even sharper than pain, a sense of becoming, a knowledge that her suffering had turned into a path carved not just for herself, but for all who dared to follow. The girl's nights were no longer her own. Since the day the villagers had first seen the scars upon her back, sleep brought her no peace. Each time her eyes closed, she was carried into a realm of shadows and flickering lights where the air was heavy with presence. The dreams came without warning, sweeping her into visions that felt more real than the waking world. In them, she wandered across vast landscapes she had never seen. Hills carved with ridges, rivers that twisted like serpents, valleys hidden in mist. Though her body lay still in the hut, her spirit walked paths that seemed to echo the lines engraved upon her skin. At first she feared these visions. She would wake gasping, sweat dampening her brow, trembling from sights she could not explain. But slowly, as the dreams returned night after night, she began to notice a pattern. The same places repeated themselves, guiding her deeper each time. She recognized the bend of a river from her scars, the spiral of a hill that mirrored the mark on her shoulder blade. It was as though the map on her back was alive, leading her spirit step by step into its hidden world. And then came the whispers. They began faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of leaves or the sigh of wind. But as the nights passed, the voices grew clearer. They were not the voices of the living but of something older, low, resonant, filled with weight. Sometimes they spoke in fragments she barely understood, urging her to remember, to listen, to walk. Other times they called her by name, not the name given by her guardians, but one she had never heard before, a name that vibrated in her bones and stirred her soul with recognition she could not explain. "You are not burden," one voice murmured through the veil of sleep. "You are path." Another whispered, "Do not fear the fire, it has written truth upon you." And still another, softer, yet filled with a strength beyond measure, told her, "The map belongs to you and you belong to us." She would wake from these dreams with her heart pounding, her body trembling as though she had carried the weight of a long journey. The hut would seem smaller each morning, the eyes of her guardians colder, the murmurs of the villagers sharper. But inside she carried the voices and they shielded her from despair. She began to understand that the punishment meant to silence her had instead opened a door that only she could walk through. One night, she dreamed of a cavern, deep and dark, its entrance hidden by roots and stone. Inside, torches burned without fire, casting light upon walls etched with the same symbols that now lived on her back. She ran her hands across the glowing carvings, and as she did, the whispers grew into a chorus, layered voices weaving together as if the ancestors themselves had gathered to speak. "Do not turn away," they urged. "Your suffering is not your end, it is your beginning. The path we drew upon your flesh is the key, and you must walk where it leads." When she awoke, she was breathless, her back tingling as if the scars themselves pulsed with life. She rose quietly, stepping into the cool night air, and gazed at the stars above. For the first time she did not feel entirely alone. The same stars her parents had once looked upon seemed to shine brighter, as though the ancestors were watching through them, confirming the truth of the dreams. She whispered a prayer, not one of desperation but of acknowledgement, her lips trembling as she promised to listen to the voices that called her. But with the whispers came weight. Not everyone believed the markings were sacred. Her guardians muttered louder than before, spreading fear that the girl was cursed, that the map on her back would draw disaster to the village. Some villagers, though awed, avoided her now, crossing the paths quickly when she appeared, their eyes flickering with unease. Yet even in their suspicion, they could not deny the strange glow of her presence. The dreams clung to her like shadows, and the words of the ancestors gave her a quiet strength that unsettled those who had once seen her as weak. Each night the voices revealed a little more. They spoke of rivers that must be crossed, mountains that must be remembered, and places buried in the earth that no eye had seen for generations. They told her she was chosen not because of her bloodline or her power, but because she had borne suffering without breaking, because cruelty had been carved into her and turned into a vessel for truth. The map was her burden, but also her weapon. There were times when she resisted, when the weight of destiny felt too heavy for her thin shoulders. She would whisper back into the dark, "I am only a girl. Why me? Why must I carry this pain?" The voices never answered directly, but their presence wrapped around her like a cloak, and though she still wept in silence, she began to believe that perhaps her suffering had meaning after all. The villagers noticed changes in her. Her eyes seemed deeper, her steps steadier, her silence no longer that of fear but of someone listening to something beyond the reach of ordinary ears. They whispered of her whispers, not knowing what they meant, but sensing she was being shaped into something they could neither control nor understand. And though her guardians still tried to shame her, the fire of authority had left their voices, replaced by unease. For they too saw that the child they had branded was no longer theirs to command. And so the girl carried her secret, the map that lived on her back and the voices that lived in her dreams. What once had been only pain was now a language written into her skin, spoken each night by those who had walked before. And though fear remained, it was no longer her master. The ancestors had claimed her, and their whispers had begun to shape her into more than a girl. They were shaping her into a guide, a vessel of a destiny that the world around her was only beginning to fear. The whispers of the ancestors had begun to steady the girl's heart, but the eyes of her guardians only grew sharper with suspicion and hunger. They had seen the way the elders studied her scars, had heard the whispers in the village that the markings resembled a map. To them it was not destiny or warning. It was opportunity. The same irons they had pressed into her back now seemed, in their eyes, to have transformed into a key that could unlock fortunes. Their cruelty had accidentally created what they thought was their golden path. Her stepmother was the first to voice it openly, her tone sharp with greed. If the spirits have chosen to write on her skin, then it is not for her. She is a child, useless and weak. What would she do with such power? No, this map is for us. We have carried her weight, fed her scraps, and suffered her misfortune. If there are riches hidden in those scars, then it is ours by right. Her words dripped with venom, yet beneath them was desperation. The family had grown poorer with each season, their animals fewer, their fields barren. Where others saw mystery in the girl's wounds, the guardians saw only the chance to lift themselves above the shame of decline. Her stepbrothers, emboldened by their mother's greed, began to circle the girl like vultures. "Show us where it leads," one demanded, gripping her wrist so tightly that her bones ached. "If you truly see rivers and hills in your dreams, then guide us. Lead us to the treasure the ancestors promised. You owe us this, for all the food we have given you." Another jeered, "If you resist, remember, you are nothing without us. We can still make the irons burn again." The girl said nothing, but her silence was no longer the silence of fear. The voices of the ancestors echoed within her, urging her to endure, to watch, to wait. The guardians began to plan aloud, speaking in hushed tones at night when they thought she could not hear. They argued about the wealth they would find. The stepmother imagined chests filled with gold, enough to buy her way into respect she had long lost. The brothers fantasized about cattle herds that would stretch across fields, and wives brought from distant villages. They spoke as though the riches were already theirs, as though the girl was merely a tool they would wield until the map had served its purpose. Yet even in their planning there was fear. They had heard the elders warn that cruelty invited curses, that the ancestors marked the girl for a reason greater than wealth. But greed is a fire that eats away at caution. The stepmother dismissed the warnings with a bitter laugh. The elders are fools, frightened of shadows. If the ancestors have hidden treasure, why would they not give it to those who are strong enough to take it? This girl is nothing without us. Her flesh may carry the map, but her feet will walk where we command. The girl heard all of this, her heart heavy with dread. She did not want to lead them. She did not believe the map was meant for their hands, nor for riches of the earth. The voices of the ancestors had told her she was chosen, that the path was hers alone. But what power did she have to resist them? They had beaten her, starved her, burned her. They could do it again. Her body bore the memory of their cruelty, yet her spirit, though shaken, had begun to root itself in something stronger. Still, she knew that if she refused, they would not hesitate to force her. The day soon came when the stepmother seized her by the arm and dragged her before the family. "You will take us to where the markings lead," she hissed, her eyes gleaming. "You will walk in front and we will follow. If you try to deceive us, you will taste the iron again." Her words were cruel, but her hands trembled as she spoke, for she too feared the strange power of the scars. The girl nodded slowly, though inside she whispered a prayer to the ancestors. She did not know how she would endure what was to come, but she trusted the voices that had guided her through her dreams. The villagers began to notice the family's sudden obsession. They saw the guardians questioning the girl harshly, dragging her by the wrist, pressing her for answers she did not give. Whispers spread that the stepmother planned to exploit what had been given, to twist the gift of the ancestors into a tool for greed. Some villagers warned her quietly, urging caution, but none dared to intervene openly. To meddle in family matters was to invite blood feuds, and besides, many feared what the map might reveal. At night, when the girl lay on her mat, the voices came again. They did not promise her safety. Instead, they reminded her of strength. "The map is not theirs," they whispered, their tones low and steady. "It was carved into you by fire and spirit, and it answers only to your heart. Let them follow, let them hunger, but remember, the path belongs to you." The girl closed her eyes, clutching the whispers like a lifeline. She knew her guardian's greed would drive them into the unknown, but she also knew that the ancestors would not let cruelty claim what was meant for truth. By dawn, the family gathered their meager possessions and prepared to leave the village, their eyes burning with anticipation of treasure. The girl walked ahead of them, her back aching with every step, the scars glistening faintly under the sun. To those who watched them depart, it seemed like a family pursuing fortune. But the girl knew differently. She was not leading them to wealth. She was leading them into the heart of a destiny they could neither imagine nor control. The villagers watched in silence as the Steppe family prepared to leave, their faces filled with greedy determination. The girl stood among them, shoulders heavy, though she had no choice. Her stepmother's eyes gleamed with the hunger of one who had tasted a secret too large to be kept hidden. The scars upon the girl's body, no longer dismissed as marks of shame but revealed as a living map, had become their compass. They believed treasure lay at the end, and they would not let her rest until she led them to it. That night, before dawn broke, the stepmother's harsh hand shook her awake. "Up, cursed child. The spirits carved you for us, not for yourself. You will walk until these marks show us where riches lie." The girl, weary and trembling, said nothing. Resistance was useless, even her silence was turned against her. They bound her wrists with rope, not trusting her to walk freely. It was not guidance they wanted from her, but control. The journey began as the rooster crowed, with only a handful of possessions carried on their backs. Her steps fell upon the dirt road reluctantly, but the map, etched deep upon her skin, seemed to react to each movement. By the time they entered the forest's edge, faint light shimmered across the scars. A glow, barely visible in daylight, pulsed like the slow beat of a heart. The Steppe family gasped, fear mixing with wonder. "The path welcomes us," said her stepbrother. "We will be kings before long." The deeper they went, the more the forest pressed in. Branches arched overhead like a cage, and shadows swallowed the trail behind them. The girl shivered, but not only from fear. The scars upon her arms and back burned with warmth as if alive. And then, when danger approached, a snake coiled in the grass, its body ready to strike. The map glowed bright, warning her. She stepped aside just in time. Her stepfamily, startled, stared with wide eyes. "The map protects her," muttered the stepmother. "It must be for us too. Keep her alive until we reach what is ours." Days stretched into nights and nights into weeks. The girl walked, her body weary, but she noticed something the others did not. Each time the map glowed, it guided them not toward safety, but deeper into darkness. When wild beasts circled, when rivers threatened to sweep them away, when poisonous plants brushed their legs, the marks pulsed and led them further still. She began to understand. This was no gift of gold, no promise of riches. It was a path carved by cruelty, reflecting back what had been done to her. At night, by the dim firelight, the Steppe family quarreled. "We are close," said the stepmother. "The spirits test us. Endure and treasure will be ours." The girl listened quietly, hearing instead the whispers of the forest, the rustle of leaves that sounded like voices, the groaning trees that carried warnings. "Do not follow them," the whispers seemed to say. "But do not resist either. Cruelty must walk its own road." On the seventh night, a proverb was born. It rose not from her lips but from her heart, carved as surely as the scars upon her body. Cruelty carves its own path, and the path always leads to fear. She repeated it silently, over and over, as if it were a shield against despair. Her stepbrothers grew restless. The forest had no end. Their bellies ached with hunger, their feet blistered, and their eyes hollowed. Yet greed kept them moving. Each glow of the map renewed their hope, though the girl knew better. The glow was no promise of safety but a warning of what lay ahead. They entered swamps where shadows writhed, cliffs where the wind screamed like angry spirits, and caves where the earth trembled beneath their feet. Still, the Steppe family pressed forward, dragging her along. But the girl began to notice another truth. While the map burned brightest at the sight of danger, it also dimmed when she acted with kindness, even in small ways. Once, when her youngest stepbrother stumbled and nearly fell into a ravine, she reached to steady him. In that moment, the scars dulled to silence, as if the cruelty that had birthed them recoiled at the gesture. The boy pulled away with a snarl, ashamed at being helped, but she kept the lesson in her heart. The journey into darkness was not only through the forest. It was within them. Greed twisted their faces, cruelty sharpened their voices, and suspicion gnawed at their bonds. They began to accuse one another of slowing the journey, of hiding secret knowledge. The girl remained quiet, walking where she was forced, but her silence became power. Each step carried her deeper into the unknown, yet also closer to the truth of the scars. By the time the moon had waned and grown full again, the forest had swallowed them entirely. The villagers who had once watched them leave whispered of their absence, but no one dared to follow. It was said later, when the tale was retold, that the girl's scars had not been carved for treasure at all. They were warnings, lessons burned into flesh by forces unseen. And so, the story became a proverb repeated in hushed tones by firesides: cruelty carves its own path, and the path always leads to fear. The villagers understood it to mean that those who act with malice will be guided not to triumph but to ruin, and those who walk in kindness will see the glow of danger dim. The girl, still walking in that story, remained the unwilling torchbearer of cruelty's map, her body carrying the lesson of all who mistreated her. For every step into darkness, she carried within her the faint hope of light. The first stop on the map was a clearing in the forest where the trees bent inward, their branches clawing toward the sky like desperate hands. Her stepfamily expected treasure to be buried beneath the roots, but when they dug, the ground released not gold but a foul stench. From the soil rose bones, cracked and half-buried, as though the earth had kept the remains of countless forgotten travelers. The stepbrothers dropped their tools in horror, their laughter silenced. The girl watched quietly, her scars glowing faintly as though mocking their greed. The second stop lay beyond a river that whispered instead of rushing. When they leaned close to drink, the water spoke in voices that named their cruelties aloud. The stepmother heard her own deeds repeated: "You starved the child. You struck her when she wept. You bound her hands." She recoiled, trembling. The stepbrothers too heard their sins chanted, the river refusing to forget what they wished buried. No treasure shone beneath the waters, only truth, sharp as stone. At the third stop, the night grew thicker than pitch. Their fire sputtered and died, and in the darkness shadows walked with them. They had no faces, no bodies, only shapes that clung to the edges of vision. When the stepbrothers mocked the girl, the shadows drew closer, echoing their laughter in voices not their own. Each insult they threw came back at them, louder, twisted, until they trembled, clutching each other like frightened children. By the fourth stop, exhaustion weighed on them. The map led to a cave mouth blacker than midnight. Inside, whispers filled the air. Not the whispers of ancestors, but the voices of every cruelty they had spoken, multiplied and hurled back at them. The words pressed down on them, louder and louder, until the brothers covered their ears and screamed. The girl, though weary, felt the voices wash over her differently. They did not belong to her, and so they passed through her like wind. It was then they began to understand, or at least to fear. Each stop on the path revealed not riches but reflections of their own cruelty. The bones in the earth, the river of truth, the mocking shadows, the cavern of voices, none of these were punishments from outside. They were mirrors, and the mirrors would not lie. The stepmother's bravado faltered. Her hands shook, her eyes darted into the trees, where shapes seemed to stir though no wind blew. "The spirits test us," she muttered again, but her voice carried less strength. Her sons no longer believed her. Their faces were pale, their steps hesitant. The glow of the girl's scars now frightened them. Where once they had seen a path to wealth, now they saw it as a curse, dragging them deeper into places they could not endure. The girl said nothing. She did not need to. Each horror confirmed what she had already begun to understand. Cruelty does not lead to glory but to fear. And now her stepfamily, who had carved their lives from cruelty, trembled like children before the dark. By the fifth stop they no longer marched with certainty. They stumbled, muttering, clinging to one another. The greed that had burned so hot now cooled to dread. Each glow of the scars made them flinch, for they knew it did not mean safety but another truth revealed, another horror waiting. One by one fear swallowed them. Their arrogance dissolved into silence, their laughter into shivers. Where they had once commanded the girl, they now followed her, not with power but with desperation. The map had awakened what they had long buried, the knowledge that cruelty has no treasure, only a mirror that shows what one truly is. The path twisted deeper into the forest, where the air grew heavy and the trees pressed close, their roots knotted like the bones of giants. The girl's scars glowed faintly, pulling them forward, though none of her stepfamily wanted to move. Each step felt like surrender, each turn heavier than the last. Their greed, once sharp, was now dulled by dread, but still they followed, for turning back was no longer possible. The map led them to a valley where the mist never lifted. It clung to their skin, thick and cold, as though hands reached from the fog to hold them still. In the distance shapes moved. At first they seemed like shadows, but then faces appeared. Faces the stepmother knew, faces her sons could not forget. They were not strangers. They were the spirits of those they had wronged. The neighbors cheated, the friends betrayed, the children mocked, the elders disrespected. Every cruelty they had committed had a face, and now those faces stood before them. The stepbrothers tried to laugh it off, but their voices broke. Their eyes darted wildly as the spirits stepped closer, silent yet suffocating. One spirit, bent and frail, pointed a finger at the eldest brother. His voice was no more than a whisper, yet it cut like a blade. "You stole my harvest." The boy's knees buckled, for he remembered the deed well, and the shame he had buried clawed up from within him. Another spirit, cloaked in shadow, turned to the younger brother. "You struck me when I could not fight back." His face drained of color, and his mouth opened in a silent cry. The stepmother tried to speak, to command, but her voice cracked. She raised her hand as if to dismiss the spirits, but more emerged from the mist, their eyes glowing with an unearthly fire. Among them she saw a woman's face she could never forget, the girl's mother. The spirit stepped forward, her presence both gentle and terrible. Her eyes fixed on the stepmother, and though her lips barely moved, the words rang like thunder, "You made my child suffer." The stepmother staggered backward, shaking her head, but there was nowhere to flee. The mist curled tighter, the spirits surrounding them like a circle that would not break. The brothers fell to their knees, sobbing, begging for mercy, but the spirits did not strike with hands or weapons. Their punishment was far worse. They forced the family to see themselves as they truly were, cruel, selfish, weak. Every lie, every blow, every insult replayed before their eyes, magnified until it crushed them. The girl stood apart, watching in silence. Her scars glowed brighter than ever, casting her in a pale light that seemed untouchable by the shadows. The spirits did not approach her. Instead, they bowed their heads slightly as though acknowledging that she, who had suffered, was now shielded by their truth. She did not need to speak, her presence was enough. The stepmother screamed as the spirits pressed closer, their whispers deafening, their eyes unrelenting. Her sons clutched at her robes, begging her to save them, but she could not. The weight of their sins smothered them, leaving them trembling, broken, undone. In that final place, no iron or whip or hand touched them, yet they were consumed all the same. Fear hollowed them out, shame devoured what little strength they had, and the mist swallowed their cries until nothing remained but silence. The girl, still glowing with the map upon her back, walked out of the valley alone. Behind her, the spirits faded, their work complete. Cruelty had carved their path, and that path had led only here, into the grip of their doom. When the girl stepped out of the valley, dawn was breaking. The mist rolled back into the forest, carrying with it the echoes of screams that would never return. Her back burned with the weight of the scars, but it was no longer the pain of punishment. It was the steady warmth of truth, a reminder that she had endured what no one else could. The map had not led her to riches of gold or stone, but to a treasure far greater, freedom from those who sought to destroy her spirit. Villagers soon found her, wandering back toward the settlement with clothes torn and eyes hollow but still alive. They whispered among themselves, for her guardians were nowhere to be seen, and yet she carried no weapon, no proof of their end. Only the glow of her scars remained, faint lines and symbols etched across her skin like rivers of fire. Some said they had seen the light in their dreams before dawn, guiding them to wake and pray. Others swore they heard voices on the wind, speaking in tones not of men but of ancestors. When she was asked what had happened, she did not speak of spirits, nor of screams, nor of the doom that swallowed her stepfamily whole. She simply lowered her eyes and whispered, "The map showed them their truth." That was all she needed to say, for the villagers knew well what cruelty could bring. In time her story spread. Mothers told it to their children as a warning. Elders recited it at gatherings by the fire. They spoke not of a cursed girl nor of shameful scars, but of a path carved by cruelty itself. Her suffering had become more than her own, it had become a mirror for the entire village. No longer was she the orphan mistreated and forgotten. She was the child chosen to carry a lesson too powerful to ignore. The map upon her back never faded. Sometimes it glowed faintly at night, as though reminding her that the ancestors still walked with her. Some villagers feared the sight, but most came to see it as a blessing, a living warning that cruelty carries its own punishment. They would say, when quarrels arose or when hands lifted in anger, "Remember the girl with the map. Cruelty carves its own path, and the path always leads to fear." As she grew older, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She did not seek revenge or riches, nor did she boast of the spirits who had stood by her. She simply lived, tending the earth, caring for animals and showing kindness where she had once received none. Children followed her when she walked through the fields, tracing the faint glow on her back with their eyes, whispering in awe. To them, she was living proof that pain could be turned into something greater, that even wounds could tell a story worth remembering. The proverb outlived her, carried on the tongues of generations. In distant villages, people spoke of a girl whose scars became a map, whose suffering carved wisdom into the world. They did not always remember her name, but they remembered her truth. They remembered that those who press iron upon the innocent do not mark them with shame, they mark themselves with doom. And so the lesson endured, as steady as the earth beneath their feet. Cruelty is never forgotten, never buried. It writes itself upon the world, line by line, until the path it carves leads not to glory but to fear.